New York, Harlem, 1968. A man dressed in white spat in Frank Lucas's face in front of 60 people. Not as a metaphor, not as a figure of speech. He really spat hard right in the middle of 116th Street on a Saturday afternoon with the entire Harlem awake and present. Frank Lucas did nothing. He wiped his face with his sleeve. He kept walking. 14 days later, that group was never seen in Harlem again. There was no war. There was no shootout. There was no body found on any sidewalk. Just silence. The kind of silence that arrives suddenly where there was noise before, and that everyone in the neighborhood understands without anyone needing to explain it. But to understand what happened in those 14 days, you first need to understand what was happening in Harlem in 1968. The country was in flames. Martin Luther King had been assassinated in April. Cities were burning, Newark had burned, Detroit had burned. And in New York, in a Harlem that had already lived under decades of deliberate poverty and systematic police violence, the tension had reached a level that turned every corner into a spark waiting for the right fuel. And it was exactly within this context that a group of 8 men decided that Harlem was territory where they could operate. Not in an organized way like a structured operation, in an opportunistic way, which is sometimes more dangerous because it is less predictable. 8 white men who believed that the national chaos of 1968 had created an opening. That with the country's attention turned to the flames, with the police overstretched and politically paralyzed, there was space to establish a presence in territories that would previously have been unthinkable. They started small. Extortion of businesses on the edge of Harlem. Laundry owners, grocery store owners, small merchants who operated on the borders between neighborhoods. People who had no formal protection and who, faced with 8 men with clear threatening language, paid because the alternative seemed worse. Frank Lucas found out about it in the first week. He found out because Frank always found out. Because he had built an information network in Harlem that operated with the precision that most police departments would envy. Every barber, every bar owner, every numbers runner working his streets had the implicit obligation to let Frank know when something new appeared in the territory. And 8 men from outside extorting merchants on the edge of Harlem was definitely something new. Frank did not act immediately. He observed. He mapped. He let the situation develop enough to understand the full pattern before making any decision. That was one of the traits that separated Frank Lucas from most men in the same business. The ability not to react while gathering information. The patience to wait for the right moment instead of acting on emotion. The Saturday when everything changed arrived on a September afternoon. Frank was walking down 116th Street with 2 of his men, a routine walk through the territory, the kind of regular presence that reminded the neighborhood who kept order on the streets. Dark suit, hat, the stride of someone who doesn't need to prove anything to anyone because he has already proven everything he needed to prove. The group was on the sidewalk across the street. 8 men. White clothes, not the formal attire of the organization, but enough to communicate affiliation to anyone who understood the language. They had been drinking. They were loud. The kind of presence that, in a city like New York in 1968, was either very brave or very stupid, and the line between the two was thinner than it would seem. One of them saw Frank crossing, said something loud to the others. Laughter. Then he crossed the street, stopped in front of Frank less than a meter away. 60 people on the sidewalk. A Saturday afternoon in the heart of Harlem. Broad daylight. No possible ambiguity about what was happening. The man looked at Frank with the kind of expression that doesn't need words to communicate exactly what is being communicated. Then he spat. Directly, hard, in the face. The silence that fell over that sidewalk was instantaneous and absolute. 60 people who a second earlier had been talking, walking, living their Saturday lives stopped completely. They froze because everyone understood the weight of what had just happened. Not just the physical act, what the act represented. What was being said without words about who held power on that street, in that neighborhood, at that moment. The 2 men who were with Frank stepped forward simultaneously. Frank raised his hand. A small gesture, discreet, but absolutely clear. Stop. He took the handkerchief from his pocket. He wiped his face carefully without haste, with a slowness that was in itself a statement. He folded the handkerchief, put it back in his pocket, looked at the man in front of him for exactly 3 seconds with no identifiable expression on his face. Then he kept walking, simply kept walking, The group on the other side of the street shouted something. Laughter. The obvious interpretation of what had happened was the simplest one. Frenk Lukas had backed down. Frenk Lukas had swallowed it. Frenk Lukas, the most powerful man in Harlem, had been publicly humiliated by 8 men on his own street and had walked away without a response. That interpretation reached every corner of Harlem before nightfall, and it is exactly that interpretation that Frank had calculated would spread, because Frenk Lukas had learned one thing over 20 years of building power in an environment where power was constantly tested. The immediate emotional response is always the trap. It is what the provocateur wants. It is the terrain he chose, the moment he chose, the audience he chose. To react on the adversary's time with the emotions the adversary planted, in the public space the adversary selected, is to hand over complete control to the one who just attacked you. Frank left that sidewalk and went straight home. He did not call a meeting. He did not show anger. He did not send word to anyone. He went home, changed his clothes, sat at the table, and began to think with the coldness of a man who had turned emotional discipline into a competitive advantage over 2 decades. What he thought that night was not about the act itself. It was about the structure behind the act. 8 men do not appear in the middle of Harlem on a Saturday afternoon by chance. There was something sustaining that presence. There was someone who had given information about Frank's routine, about which street, which time, which level of public exposure would make the moment most effective as a demonstration. There was logistics behind that seemingly casual encounter that was not casual at all. Frank spent the first 3 days mapping that structure. Not personally. Through people with no visible connection to him, the kind of network that had taken years to build and existed precisely for moments when direct action would be too dangerous or too premature. He identified where the group was staying. He identified who had made contact with them before their arrival in Harlem. He identified the 2 or 3 front businesses they were using as their operational base on the edge of the neighborhood. More importantly, he identified the dependencies. Every group that operates outside its own territory has local dependencies. They need someone to provide information about the environment. They need someone to facilitate access to physical spaces. They need someone to process the money they extract. These dependencies are invisible when everything is working. They become the fatal point when someone who understands the structure decides to press in the right places. Frank pressed. On the 4th day, the man who had been providing information about movement in Harlem to the group received a visit. Not from Frank, from a man this informant had never seen before and would never see again. The conversation was short and without direct physical threat. Just the clear presentation of 2 options and the mathematical consequences of each. The informant made his decision the same day. Without local information, the group became operationally blind in a territory they did not know. On the 6th day, the owner of the space being used as their operational base on the edge of Harlem received his own visit. This time with a financial offer that made renewing the agreement with the previous group simply not economically interesting. The owner did not need much convincing. Business is business. Without a physical base, the group lost the fixed point from which they operated. On the 8th day, the financial channels being used to process the extortion money began to close. One by one, without dramatic explanation, just doors that had been opened simply stopping opening. Each isolated closure would seem like a coincidence. The pattern of 8 closures in 2 days was something else entirely. Without a functioning financial flow, the operation ceased to be economically viable. What Frank had done in 8 days was not violence. It was surgery. He had identified the 3 systems sustaining that group's presence in Harlem: information, physical space, and financial flow, and had shut each one down sequentially and silently, without any individual action appearing connected to the others. From the 10th to the 13th day, without local information, without an operational base, and without the ability to process what they extorted, the group began to fragment internally. Organizations that rely on intimidation as their main tool have a specific structural fragility. When intimidation meets resistance, it cannot identify or confront directly. Internal cohesion begins to unravel. Because the entire model is built on the premise that others' fear is greater than their own risks. When that premise is silently removed, what remains is only the risk without the return. On the 14th day, the group had left Harlem, not all at once. Gradually, in the way things really end when there is no dramatic confrontation to define the exact moment of the end. They simply stopped appearing, one by one. until the presence that had begun with 8 men on a Saturday sidewalk simply ceased to exist in the territory, without declaration, without announcement, without any victory narrative coming from Frank. Just silence where there had once been noise. Harlem noticed. Harlem always notices, not the details, but the result. And the result was clear to anyone who understood how power really works in that kind of environment. Frank Lucas had been publicly humiliated on a sidewalk on a Saturday afternoon, and 2 weeks later the problem had simply disappeared without anyone being able to point out exactly how or when. That was more frightening than any direct confrontation would have been. Because direct confrontation is understandable, it has visible cause and effect. It has a moment where you can locate the force and calculate how to respond. What Frank had done had no location, no identifiable moment, no face. It was like trying to fight the tide. You push and the water simply recedes, but the pressure never stops, and in the end it's you who is no longer there. Here is what most stories about this kind of confrontation get completely wrong. The easy narrative would be that Frank Lucas waited for the right moment and then used superior force to eliminate a lesser threat. That narrative is emotionally satisfying, but it is not what happened. And it is not what the story truly teaches. What Frank did was refuse the game being played and create an entirely different game on terrain, where he held all the advantages and the adversary could not even find the playing field. The public humiliation on that sidewalk had been designed to work in a specific way, to provoke an immediate emotional response that would lead to a confrontation on the provocateur's terms, at a moment chosen by the provocateur, with an audience selected by the provocateur. It was a trap with saliva as bait. Frank had recognized the trap the exact moment the handkerchief touched his face, and he had chosen not to step into it. Instead, he left that sidewalk carrying the most important piece of information the group had inadvertently handed over. The willingness to operate so exposed in an unknown territory revealed not strength, but the absence of it. Groups with real power do not need public gestures of dominance. Public gestures of dominance are the language of those who have nothing left. They are the sound that emptiness makes when it tries to appear full. Frank had heard that sound clearly while wiping his face, and he had worked the following 14 days with the precision of someone who knows exactly where to press on a hollow structure so that it collapses from within without needing external force to bring it down. The lesson that remains is not about power, not about force, not about who has more men or more money or more territory. It is about the interval between provocation and response. In that interval lies everything. It is there that you decide whether you will react on the adversary's time or act on your own time, whether you will use the energy of anger or the clarity of patience, whether you will respond to the audience watching or work for the result that has not yet arrived. Frank Lucas was humiliated on a sidewalk on a Saturday afternoon with 60 people watching. 14 days later, the problem had disappeared without a trace. Not because Frank was stronger, because Frank was colder, and cold, applied with precision to the right place, melts anything, even what seemed too solid to move.